Good evening. Today is March 8, 2021, and this is the 42nd episode of New Paradigm. I'm your host, Sargis Sangari. My guest today is a good friend of mine, Richard Goldberg. Richard is a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a co-host of the Limited Liability podcast presented by a Jewish Insider. From 2019 to 2020, Richard served as the Director for Countering Iranian Weapons of Mass Destruction for the White House at the National Security Council. He previously served as the Chief of Staff for the Illinois Governor Bruce Rauner and Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois in both the U.S. House and also the U.S. Senate. On the National Security Council, Richard coordinated President Trump's maximum pressure campaign on Iran, including efforts to bring Iranian oil exports to zero, impose sanctions on additional non-oil sectors of Iran's economy, and counter Iranian's nuclear and missile programs. In the state, Richard emerged as a leading architect of the toughest sanctions imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran. He was the lead Republican negotiator for 3 rounds of sanctions targeting the Central Bank of Iran, the SWIFT financial messaging services, and the entire sector of the Iranian economy. Richard also drafted and also negotiated legislation promoting human rights and democracy in Iran, including sanctions targeting entities that provided the Iranian regime with the tools of repression. His Iran sanction work has been featured in the book, The Iran Wars. As a staff associate for the House Appropriations Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations, Richard worked on a wide range of issues related to the U.S. foreign assistance, including foreign military financing, international security assistance, international peacekeeping development, global health, and economic support funds. He was a founding staff director of the House U.S.-China Working Group and was among the first Americans ever to visit China's Human Space Launch Center. A leader in efforts to expand U.S. missile defense cooperation with the State of Israel, Richard played a key role in U.S. funding the Arrow 3 program, Iron Dome, and also the development of an advanced missile defense radar to the Negev Desert. As the Illinois Governor's Chief of Staff, Richard also managed government in America's 5th largest state with all day-to-day operations, including Homeland Security, public safety, and public health. He also spearheaded the first ever state legislation to divest public pensions funds from those companies that were engaged in boycott of Israel, which sparked a nationwide initiative in state capitals around the United States. Richard holds a Bachelor of Science in Journalism and a Master's in Public Policy and Administration from our own Northwest University. He is an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserves with military experience on the Joint Staff and in Afghanistan. Richard, it's good to have you here with us again on this podcast tonight. Last time you and me met was when I had the honor of being able to host that panel that we ran looking at Quds Forces, Hezbollah, financial patterns, and sanctions, and I was honored to be able to have you there as one of the speakers. Before I introduce you to our guests, there's a video I want to be able to initially introduce as to what we are going to be discussing today.
The president needs to lay out what is American foreign policy and why is it in the best interest of international peace and security, and why sometimes America has to go it alone when we see a UN that is increasingly corrupt and controlled by countries like China and Russia.
Richard, it's good to have you here, buddy. Well said, and I would ask you, based on what you had said before, what has changed? Where are we now today as compared to what you guys did under the previous administration?
Yeah, well, it's such an honor to be here, and I recall our panel together just about a year ago before everything shut down, and we were already washing our hands religiously, as I recall, after every speaking round. And I wasn't sure if I should shake hands at the time, and we didn't know a lot about the virus, but amazing how much has changed in this country. Some obviously a lot for the worse, some for the better, as we've seen the human spirit and communities come together to overcome adversity and sadness. But great to be here, and hopefully we'll be able to do things in person soon enough with the vaccines spreading wide. I think as we look out across the world and then zoom in into the Middle East, there are a lot of changes, but there are a lot of constants. I think that even though we've had a change in power in the United States, President Biden inherits a world of foreign policy and also a domestic constituency that sees the world differently than it did 4 years ago. I think that the perspectives of the American people, particularly in Congress, towards the U.S.-China relationship have evolved. We've moved on considerably from the thesis that economic liberalization would lead to political liberalization in China. We've started to recognize China's broader strategies, not just in Asia, but throughout the world and in international organizations. We've started to build bipartisan consensus on the threats we face from Russia and where Russia meddles wherever U.S. interests are, not just at the Security Council or in the arms control arena, but throughout particularly the Middle East and beyond. And then we start zooming into where there are changes abound. And even though we leave the Trump administration behind with great hope and aspirations for Middle East peace, with the Abraham Accords emerging just towards the end of last year, normalization between Arab states and the state of Israel, something that was part of a punchline of a joke along with the Cubs winning the World Series. And yet in 4 years we had both. That is something that we would hope to build on. But there is a little bit of troubled seas ahead, not just for the regional integration picture, but what the region looks like. Because much of the common picture of the Middle East that brought Arab states, Sunni Arab states like the UAE, Bahrain, possibly in the future Saudi Arabia, others, to integrate not just their security picture, but their economic picture with the state of Israel, was their shared threat perception of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the maximum pressure campaign, the counter-Iran campaign that the Trump administration waged, really was a catalyst for expediting normalization between Sunni Arab states and the state of Israel. And it's a brand new peace paradigm, right? When we thought that the number one issue in the Middle East was the Palestinian issue, and that we could never get Arab-Israeli normalization until that was addressed, we have realized that you can go from the outside in when it comes to peace. You don't have to start from the inside and work your way out. And with normalization agreements emerging, that doesn't in any way negate the need to address the Palestinian issue and try to achieve Israeli-Palestinian peace as well. But we now realize that the issue that trumps all others in the region is Iran. It's the common thread throughout the region as we see the long arm of the Islamic Republic meddling throughout the region in what they call the Shia Crescent, from Yemen into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, into Gaza, throughout. And so where are we going with Iran policy is the biggest question of all in the transition from Trump to Biden. President Biden said during the campaign, and his staff has reiterated in the early days of his administration, his priority is to restore the old 2015 nuclear deal, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. That was a very controversial deal back in 2015. It faced bipartisan opposition in the Congress, but it was muscled through by the Obama administration, not as a treaty, therefore not subject to the votes of the U.S. Senate, but as a political agreement between a few small parties. And the Trump administration obviously felt that that agreement locked up American leverage. It relieved all of America's sanctions on Iran. It allowed them to grow their economy, deepen their hold throughout the Middle East, threaten our allies, threaten U.S. interests, continue to develop their ballistic and cruise missile programs, keep their nuclear program on ice, all the capabilities intact for a time of their choosing to threaten us. And so, reversing that policy, we brought together the Middle East. We brought together our partners and allies in the Middle East with a common view to conquer a common threat and to force Iran to a choice, behave like a normal nation or otherwise face a maximum pressure campaign and be increasingly isolated and rolled back throughout the region. And the maximum pressure campaign had incredible success. While we see headlines today of nuclear enrichment or rocket attacks in Iraq or a tanker from South Korea being seized in the Gulf, these are extortion tactics of a regime that is flailing and that is running out of money. But when we look at the budget, when we look at the currency, when we look at inflation, we look at the economic indicators, the regime is slowly coming apart at the seams. And they put on a good face, as any authoritarian dictatorship would, with a lot of propaganda and planting stories and claiming different things are going on when they aren't. We see that in the budget numbers for Iranian proxies throughout the region having dropped precipitously, the Iranian defense budget having dropped, the budget to the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, having dropped. And so while we have to take their threats of nuclear enrichment and other hostile acts very seriously and demonstrate our willingness to use force if we must as a deterrent, the leverage that we have to get Iran back to a negotiating table and to force fundamental behavioral changes hinges on our ability to impose secondary sanctions, as we call them, where we put countries, banks, companies around the world to a choice. You do business with Iran or you do business in the United States. You can't do both. What the Biden administration is saying when they say they want to go back into the old deal is that they would like to lift these sanctions, infuse the Iranian economy with billions of dollars as a way to get the Iranians to simply talk about a range of malign activities, not to commit to anything, and to stop their enrichment activities. In other words, pay the Iranian extortion racket. It would be a mistake on many, many levels, and we could talk about that.
No, really, I do understand what you're saying, because when I was looking at it originally on March 5th was when President Biden authorized the continuation of the national emergency with respect to Iran, which by doing so, the administration was able to effectively extend the Iran sanctions for, per the executive order 12957, I believe it was, for a year. Also though, on the same day, 5 March, the Biden administration also agreed to release frozen Iranian assets in Iraq, and according to Iran trade official Hamid Husseini, nearly $3 billion in Iranian funds have been frozen or have been released in Iraq. In Oman and South Korea, with roughly $7 billion of those Iranian assets frozen in South Korea, more than $6 billion, at least, of those assets in Iraq, nearly $20 billion that are frozen in China that made a lot of money on Iran, using just the interest on the oil it was holding for Iran through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization agreements, almost $2 billion frozen in Luxembourg, and an unknown amount frozen in Oman, with over $35 billion of those dollars that can be released now to Iran, as you were indicating, depending on which way the Biden administration wants to head. So the Biden administration's release of billions of dollars in frozen Iranian assets is kind of akin to what was referred to as the carrot approach that was used by the Obama administration with the release of nearly $1.3 billion at that time, which we witnessed in frozen Iranian assets, and then the creation, as you had mentioned in your opening statement, with the JCPOA, and then it was a very stark contrast to what we saw under the previous administration, the President Trump administration, which you were a member of the National Security Council on, which used really the stick under the Trump administration, which withdrew also from the JCPOA and implemented far tougher sanctions than ever seen on Iran. I guess my question would be, in this case, how is foreign policy changing? Is there anything that has been done on the previous administration that you served under, if we are going to release those funds again back to the Iranian government? Is it possible that, from what has been discussed, that the timeline for them being able to achieve a nuclear weapon capability that may happen at least under the current Biden administration over the next 4 years, or do you see something different?
Yeah, it's a big issue and it's a lot to unpack, so let's take it a little bit of an issue at a time. The first thing to remember is that even though, and I personally disagree with this, but the policy as it is stated by President Biden is that he will return to the JCPOA and lift sanctions only if and once Iran fully returns to its own commitment, strict compliance with the JCPOA. That's the stated policy. And so it is surprising to see press reports of $1 billion here and $1 billion there, whether it's South Korea, Iraq, or Oman being released to the regime just to get them to come to a negotiating meeting or some sort of a discussion meeting that the Europeans have proposed that the EU would host. That does not sound like it's in compliance with the policy as stated by the Biden administration, so there's an inconsistency there. I think what they would say is that they have not lifted any sanctions. They're merely relaxing existing restrictions in compliance with U.S. sanctions that allow the regime to use money that has been frozen for different purposes. And so that, of course, is sort of a sneaky way to get sanctions released to the regime without doing something that attracts a lot of public attention, like taking something off of Treasury sanctions lists or issuing a waiver to Congress for a law that requires sanctions. This is something that can be done by a phone call or a letter that never gets released publicly from the Department of Treasury to a bank in Baghdad, to the central bank there, to a bank in South Korea, etc. So that's a worrisome sign. The second piece here is, of course, that a lot of these institutions that are subject to sanction, the reason why this money is frozen, especially if we take the case of South Korea, the oil money that Iran wants access to, these billions of dollars that are sitting in Seoul, are frozen because they belong to the National Iranian Oil Company. And if you go ahead and Google this and say NIOC, or National Iranian Oil Company, terrorism, Treasury, you're going to find out that the Treasury Department has imposed sanctions in the last 2 years on NIOC, the National Iranian Oil Company, because of its connection to the IRGC, because these funds fuel terrorism. And so these are U.S. terrorism sanctions, not just nuclear sanctions that we were told could be lifted under the JCPOA. This creates a really big problem for the Biden administration because obviously there is no demand on the table at this point that Iran must cease its sponsorship of terrorism. One other point to make. We've seen in recent days the reporting that rocket attacks have resumed against U.S. forces. We had the attack conducted against U.S. forces in Erbil in northern Iraq, in the Kurdish areas. We've also had a follow-on attack over in western Iraq against a U.S. base that actually resulted in the death of a U.S. contractor. And so we have not seen a response to this last strike. We obviously saw a response, belated, albeit a response in Syria to the first strike on Erbil. There has been no response yet to the second strike that has actually resulted in an American death. But we see a report just a couple of days later of billions of dollars being released from Iraq to Iran. Now, we need to get confirmation on all of this. This is the Iranians claiming they have access to these funds. It is possible. My sort of tinfoil cap is on as I sort of read the tea leaves of where the Biden administration would go and where all of these officials that are serving the administration, who were the same people who negotiated the Iran deal, how they would try to sequence confidence-building measures, as they would call them, to relax restrictions on funds in exchange for the Iranians coming to talks. But you know, the signal, if you're in Tehran looking at this, is across the board weakness, unfortunately. And it's now, how much can we get for how little can we give up? And that will be the Iranian calculus across the board. That will be true in their nuclear program, in their missile program, in their regional activities, in their sponsorship of terrorism. How much can we get from the world in exchange for giving up as little as possible? That's what they achieved in the JCPOA, and that's what they will be looking to achieve now with the Biden administration.
No, I agree with you on that one, Richard. You know, just in January, as you know, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, came out and stated that Iran's nuclear breakout time, which is the amount of time that Iran needs to really produce enough fissile material for one nuclear weapon, has shortened. And he was trying to say that it's shortened from over 9 months under the JCPOA to a 3 to 4 month period today. However, Israel Energy Minister Yuval Steiner recently claimed that Iran's nuclear breakout time is, I think, closer to what he said, 6 months. So if they do everything the right way, still others have estimated that Iran nuclear breakout time might be somewhere within a 2-year period. Regardless, it would fall directly under the next 4 years of a Biden administration. As you know, that the Deputy Secretary of State nominee is really the one who was the architect for the JCPOA. I have said one of the problems that we've always had when it comes to Iran, regardless of which estimate is accurate, Iran will likely amass enough highly enriched uranium to develop at least a nuclear weapon at some point. And I'm not sure if really a lot of people within the current administration who served in the Obama administration really cared if Iran had the nuclear capabilities or not. To include some of the Europeans may have just said, you know, it will be eventually time for them to have that capability. My issue with this is that when we have looked at Iran, I don't think we've ever had a foreign policy from an American perspective on Iran. I truly believe that and when the Iranian Revolution took place, because Iran did not become communist and went Islamic, our foreign policy was focused still on Russia. So we ended up just doing nothing more than crossing the border and actually putting our eggs in Saddam's basket, trying to counter against Russia, and we never developed a coherent foreign policy for Iran itself, which, as you see between administration to administration, Iran is now using the JCPOA as leverage, saying, look, you know what, we limited the JCPOA to really look at only the nuclear weapon capability rather than the missile capabilities, because we couldn't trust that America was going to be beholden to the JCPOA. And when we pulled out of the JCPOA, they're using that now even as leverage, saying, well, we can't trust you, so you're going to have to even limit the next JCPOA scope to what we want for leverage, because, of course, Israel is the one who actually has to deal with a lot of the foreign policy mistakes that we make through the decades. But from your perspective, are we ever going to be able to have a coherent foreign policy from a U.S. perspective in Iran? And if not, how is that going to affect our partners on the ground in Israel?
So I think first of all, this really fits with the title of your show, because I think this is the fundamental question of what is the paradigm for U.S. policy on this issue, and I think it fits into what is the paradigm for our strategic framework for the broader Middle East. I think you start with a couple of questions that you have to ask yourself, and depending on how you answer them is how you're going to put together that strategic framework. Number one, is Iran an enemy of the United States? Is it a threat to the United States? Or is it a potential ally or partner of the United States? There are people who believe the latter. And this is an ideological view that looks at the behavior of this regime as rational. It says, America meddled in the Iranian state going back to 1953 with Mossadegh and the CIA coup, and that this Islamic Republic has real grievances against the West. And they see a region where Israel has nuclear weapons, and they look the other way and see Pakistan with nuclear weapons, and they see U.S. nuclear weapons potentially stored at a NATO ally in the region, and they see ballistic missiles being developed in the region, and they say, Well, we were also victims during the Iran-Iraq war of missiles, and so very rational that we want our own missile program. We want our own nuclear program. We're just trying to look out for ourselves in this region. And that if we don't come to Iran, reset relations with you, we don't want to be enemies all the time. We share a lot of commonalities. And so when we look back at the JCPOA, there was a little bit of this in the strategic framework, in the paradigm they adopted that was the JCPOA, that we could partner with Iran and Shia militias in Iraq and Hezbollah in Syria in the counter-ISIS campaign. That was a line of effort that we could communicate with Iran on. It was a shared interest. And that there could be other shared interests in the region as well if we changed our attitude and our policies towards this regime. Now, obviously, I disagree with all of that. This is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. It is a maniacal dictatorship, theocracy. Its sort of obsession with the state of Israel is the least rational foreign policy or national security position that you could find pretty much anywhere in the world when you see how they approach Israel. And so we look at them today and say, okay, they're a threat, they're an enemy, they have killed Americans in Iraq, they have killed Americans in other areas, they continue to perpetrate terrorism overseas. And so, yes, this is an enemy. Okay, next question. If they kill an American, if they want to build a nuclear weapon, if they want to do something that constitutes a direct threat to U.S. national security interests, do you have a willingness at the end of the day to use military force if all other options fail to deter that aggression? If the answer is no, for whatever reason, the ideological resolve is not there, the political resolve is not there, then you adopt an appeasement strategy towards the Islamic Republic, which is to say we're not willing to use force to stop their nuclear program ultimately. Therefore, if we just impose sanctions and they continue making progress towards a nuclear weapon, we will not stop them from getting a nuclear weapon. Therefore, we should ask them how much they want to stop movement towards a nuclear weapon, and we will pay their price. And we will not be able to address other issues. And if they attack Americans or they do other things, we could cut off the money. But we will build a framework in the Middle East that is built around this sort of policy. You saw that happening. Others did at DOD during the JCPOA period, where we allowed our forces in Iraq to become vulnerable to partner with Shia militias controlled by Tehran, because this was part of this new framework. And obviously, Iran wanted the money to flow. We weren't going to confront them. We could have a little bit of a more relaxed posture there. We saw that happen in other areas as well. And so you combine that with Iran's willingness to continue to stretch in any of the areas not covered by the appeasement agreement, the JCPOA, and Iran starts testing longer and longer range missiles. And Iran starts fomenting conflicts in other countries, and Iran continues its sponsorship of terrorism. But if you cut off the money, then the deal collapses. If you reimpose sanctions for any of these non-nuclear reasons, even if you say you're allowed to, the deal collapses, and then their nuclear extortion takes over again. And so the reason why the Trump administration's policy was heading in a successful direction and why it brought the region together around Iran is because ultimately the Iranians believed that President Trump was willing to use force to stop its nuclear program. And he called their bluff to some extent, that the enrichment that we see outwardly is meant for the media, is meant for political pressure. It's meant to have headlines that their breakout timeline, quote unquote, has been reduced, so that you feel pressure to do something to address that issue quickly. And we're seeing that happen already, shifting into the Biden administration, where they increase their enrichment. We see statements about how much of a crisis that is because of their breakout timeline to nuclear weapons being used. And therefore, we're unwilling to push back on other areas. We just want to know what their price is to stop the enrichment, and we'll return to this appeasement policy. President Trump said, you can continue to enrich uranium, but there's a red line there. if you cross the red line, I have a bunch of sites on the list, and we're going to hit those sites. And by the way, if you attack a base in Iraq and you kill an American, we're going to take out one of your IRGC commanders. We're not going to bother with a Shia militia operating in Syria. We're going to hold Tehran responsible. And so you create a box where the Iranians, if they move outside the box one way to threaten Americans through violence, they know that they might incur a military response. And they don't want that. If they move outside the box a different direction on their nuclear program, they might incur a military response. And again, they don't want that. They value regime survival. And so you keep them in this box, and you lower the box down slowly through the sanctions pressure. And you keep squeezing until finally they say, okay, we're ready to talk, we have different ideas. And we were getting to that point. If we start lifting the box back up by relieving the sanctions pressure and let the Iranians go either way they want on their nuclear program and on violence against Americans without any credible threat of a military deterrent, then the whole paradigm falls apart, and we're back into this position of weakness where really all we're left with is saying, how much money would it cost you to knock it off? A classic extortion racket.
No, I hear you, Richard, loud and clear, and unfortunately, I don't know if that's going to hold true under the current administration. I know that you had really been one of the main architects, if not the architect, for these sanction policies that you're talking about right now. I know that we're running short on time, but I want to make sure that we have a video of when you were initially asked about how it also affects our partners in the region. I want to be able to show that so people know how far in advance you had looked at where we would be today. If you could play that video.
Welcome back. Well, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Davos gave him the opportunity to lobby President Trump and European leaders in person on what he says is the greatest threat to Israel, the Iran nuclear agreement. Trump has adopted Netanyahu's old formulation that the deal must be fixed or nixed, but the Israeli leader has now raised the ante, saying it must be fully fixed or fully nixed. But will Iran be willing to accept new terms? Here's what Netanyahu said at Davos.
You said that if its fatal flaws are not fixed, you should walk away from it, and I want you to know that if you decide to do that, then we will back you all the way. We also appreciate the fact that you confront Iran's aggression with us and with other parties in the region as never before. I've never seen the realistic alliance between the United States, Israel, and your other allies in the region as strong, as unified as it is under your leadership.
Well, for more, we're joined from London by Iranian journalist and analyst Camelia Entekhabafab. And from Washington, joining us is Richard Goldberg, senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Richard, let me start with you. Prime Minister Netanyahu taking a maximalist approach. We can get some of the details on fixing that Iran nuclear agreement. The Europeans would probably only accept smaller changes. Where do you think President Trump is going to go? Is he going to, you think, reach common ground with the Europeans, or take that more, let's say, hardline approach advocated by Netanyahu?
Well, Kalev, Iman, thanks for having me. It's a great question. The bottom line is the president has made his red lines clear. He released a statement 2 weeks ago when he waived the sanctions against the Central Bank of Iran. He said, this is the last time I'm doing this. You have to fix the deal or I'm going to nix the deal. Very similar to words we've heard out of the Prime Minister. And he laid out 3 conditions that he wanted to see. He wanted to see the sunsets go away, these famous sunsets where in the out years of the deal, Iran starts to be able to do things legally, legitimately under the deal with regard to enrichment and missiles and arms embargoes going away. He wants to see inspections in military facilities. We know that right now that's not happening. The IAEA has not requested those visits. The Iranians have said they will never allow such visits. And he wants to truly address the ballistic missile program of Iran Because we know, as the president said, as the prime minister has said, as others have said, that is a core piece of a future nuclear weapons capability.
And Camelia and Habifard in London. Camelia, this American administration wants to change or amend an agreement already signed by Iran and the previous American administration. From the Iranian point of view, why should they agree to any changes whatsoever?
Good evening to dear all. In Iranian point of view, I'm not saying if they can agree with any changes as what it is and called Iran nuclear deal, but very much is possible to have some negotiations for an amendment, as a dear friend in Washington referred to, for example, for the timing of Iran, suspend its enriching nuclear enrichments after the 10 years of the deal getting expire, and also about Iran capabilities in ballistic. But we are already seeing some changes has been reported in Iranian behaves to please President Trump, in my opinion. And President Trump is also unexpected person. He can always change his mind. We saw in many different ways, which unpredictably the president has a different opinion in different matters. For example, today the U.S. military has been reported that there was no encounter between American Navy in the Persian Gulf and the Revolutionary Guards speedboats, which in the past 2 years, 50 encounter has been reported, but in the past 5 months ago, basically zero. Or today, Houthis, the rebels in Yemen, released an American has been kidnapped, and they were expressed their wishes to open up peace talk negotiations in Oman. And we understand Oman is usually helping Iran and the United States to solve some of the issues in the past. If those regional reasons addressed by Iranians well at the head of the French minister visiting Tehran in March 5th,
yes,
we could say some maybe door will open for the better negotiations on Iran deal.
Yes, Richard, back to you in Washington. And Richard, we know the president wants to amend certain things in the Iran deal, but even within his own administration, not everyone agrees that touching this deal and amending it, as he in fact promotes, would be good for Iran or for the United States.
Well, that's right, and this is a fundamental point. If you don't believe that you can ever leave the deal, that nixing it is not actually a viable option, that really changes the dynamic. It limits the options that the president and others internationally have with regard to fixing a deal. The president of the United States has to make it clear he has a viable option to leave the deal. The world will not end. The international community might not like it. The Europeans might not like it. But U.S. sanctions will have their full force again, and a European bank, a European business, is not going to risk violating these sanctions and then lose their access to the U.S. market. Once that has been laid down as a marker, then you can talk about fixing the deal. Because fixing the deal would require really tying the toughest sanctions that were given away in the deal, the Central Bank of Iran sanctions, the disconnection of Iranian banks from SWIFT, tying those back to all of these other conditions that the president has talked about. What we really need to wait and see is the Europeans right now are saying, oh no, we do care about Iranian missiles. We want to do something about that. But what kind of missiles? And are they willing to threaten all the sanctions that were given away in the nuclear deal in exchange for those red lines? If they're not willing to do that, if they're not willing to threaten bringing back Central Bank of Iran sanctions, it's not going to matter.
Okay, Richard, I want to go to Camille just on exactly that point. On the ballistic missile program, would Iran accept linking the limitations on the ballistic missile program to a deal on its nuclear program? It's two different subjects.
Iran Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei clearly signaled that to the Western countries and the United States, which Iran stop producing ballistic missile with the longer range than 2,000 kilometers. They simply said we are not going to produce more than these ranges to make any threat, for example, to the United States or states of Israel. If that signal is correct, And if that be expected, and they said Iranian wouldn't do any longer making such a ballistic missile over than these ranges, we should believe that there is a back channel has been opened for the negotiation between Western countries, Iran, and maybe the United States. Let it but happen during Ahmadinejad's time, ahead of Iran and U.S. nuclear talks with the Western power. If that back channel can help Iranian to do negotiation over the missile and over the regional influences and interferences, we could say Iranian will be able to buy some time ahead of the May when President Trump, which is very much serious, as our friend says, to withdraw from Iran nuclear deal. But the deal is very important for Iran. It's the matter of the Iran revolution and the Islamic Republic existence and the economy, which collapsing the deal would be jeopardize the authority of the regime.
Yes, Camelia and Khabarpar in London and Richard Goldberg in Washington, thank you both very much for joining us for this debate, and still to come on The Rundown.
Richard, you had it perfectly penned from day one when you supported the administration at the National Security Council to say this is where we're going to be at. And, elections do have consequences. We are now in a position where today we have American B-52 bombers that are being escorted by Israeli fighter jets in the Persian Gulf. And I'm not sure if with the changes that have taken place with the release on the sanctions, if we might be closer to war within the region than we are to where we could have had a long-term peace, probably more of a leverage in the new JCPOA. I'm going to give you the last word. I know we went a little bit longer than we usually do, but you're a great guest, and we'll have you back again in the future to discuss these pressing issues and topics. Where do you see us in the near future? And again, if you can reemphasize, how can we go back and possibly try to cap Iran's ability over the next 4 years to be able to get the nuclear bomb?
Well, I think it's important that for those who oppose a return to the Iran nuclear deal, to be very vocal about that and to understand why it is that if you are a bank or a company that sees a Biden administration in the future lift sanctions, that doesn't mean it's a green light to go do business with the Islamic Republic of Iran. Just because a waiver is issued or a general license is issued, when you see hundreds of members of Congress from the House, senators saying that we oppose a return to the nuclear deal, if there is a return of a Republican president to the White House, if the Republicans take control of Congress in 2 years, you could see legislation that reimposes sanctions hit the Biden administration desk. That means this is not something that is a treaty. It's not been ratified. This remains something very tenuous. And for those who are thinking about going back into Iran, don't do it, because it could be 2 years, it could be 4 years, but those sanctions will come right back into place if the behavioral conduct that drove those sanctions hasn't changed. And in the meantime, we need to do our part to encourage more Arab-Israeli normalization. We should encourage dialogue. The Abraham Accords is something historic. It remains a paradigm for the Middle East going forward. We have to build on it, we have to protect it, and we have to see other areas of opportunities to encourage more partners to join those accords, because I believe the more Arab countries that join that with U.S. support, to see a B-52 bomber flying with escorts of the Saudi, Qatari, Israeli Air Force as well, that is an incredible message to Iran, and that is a paradigm shift for the Middle East.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Richard, if people want to know more about your work and where you are today, where can they go ahead and read more about your work and follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Rich_Goldberg. You can see a lot of my work at FDD.org, Foundation of Defense and Democracies. And definitely, while I would never take anybody away from this podcast, feel free to follow us at JI Podcast. Jewish Insiders Limited Liability Podcast as well.
No, much appreciated. Our job is to support each other, mutually support each other during this process. Get the news that sometimes mainstream media just does not have the ability to get out to the people. And for those who are watching this podcast, if you take a look at the bottom link that we have, there's a QR code there. I know most of you know how it works, but just point your camera to it and we'll take it directly to Richard's podcast. Rich, we're going to have you back again. I was hoping to have us talk a little bit more about the 1-year anniversary of our discussion that took place with ACAM Chicago, but that's for a future date. And as we leave, I'm going to leave you with some of the comments that I made there during our discussion. And again, God bless. Keep up the hard work. Thank you very much for everything you did at the National Security Council for us and where we are today with the sanctions against Iran. And our hope and desire is that we will at least do what we can from our end to ensure that we are in a position where Iran comes to the negotiation table for the betterment of the U.S. rather than for the betterment of their manifest destiny, as I've called it, which Ayatollah laid in front of them 40 years ago. And with that said, Richard, God bless you in this new paradigms.
Operate the way we're operating our foreign policy from Iran perspective. And he submits his resignation to the Supreme Leader of Iran. He says, because I'm trying to get to an agreement, a new agreement, like we did before. Remember, Iran sat there and brought all the global powers that had sanctioned it over so many years to the table. That's a pretty significant, accomplishment. Now, with that said, of course, his resignation was rejected. Why was he trying to resign? Because Soleimani was running around, still conducting the initial operations that he looked at. When Iran aligned militia started destabilizing even Iraq, it became an issue for individuals within the Iranian government structure that said, if this was our toolkit of how to control the region, why is he using it to destabilizing the governments that we need stable? Iran rather have a stable Iraq in order to be able to suck as much money as he can, oil, and sell it back to them, make his profit margins. He doesn't want to see a destabilized Iraq. But Soleimani was on the track of destabilizing. Why? Because Soleimani wanted to continue as he did, operating within the region, to become the next leader of Iran, period, in this year's election. So when you strike him and kill him, not only are you expressing U.S. foreign policy, at that moment, you're resetting the pressures internal on the Iranian regime, allowing the possible, we call moderates, to take back control of where Zarif and those individuals wanted to lead us to. So, look, I was asked by a soldier of mine in the first tour in Iraq. He said, what do you think about our foreign policy? I said, what foreign policy are you talking about? He says, look, we've got all our guys here, SOCOM's on the ground, we're fighting on a daily basis. I go, that's not our foreign policy, that's not an expression. I said, remember a couple of months ago, we were driving through that enemy checkpoint and the Overwatch position was engaged by the vehicle that was behind us? He said, yes. I said, when those rounds impacted into the chest of that individual who had set up a legal checkpoint, you express your foreign policy. All these other things that we had were just pieces of individuals in a toolkit. I was an individual in the toolkit to express U.S. foreign policy. Since then, once those rounds impacted, nobody ever set up legal checkpoints in our sector anymore. Same thing. The killing of Soleimani reset everything in the negotiation process with Iran. This is how nations negotiate. We dropped 2 nukes on Japan and we brought them to the negotiation table. In this process, sometimes all these bad actors have expiration date. The art is, when do they expire? And how does that reset our ability to negotiate amongst world politics? And that's something that is these gentlemen's advice to the National Security Council and our leadership that has allowed us to get to where we are. With that said, I have to say, unless there's any closing requirements,
Speaking of expressing foreign policy, we have a few minutes left. If you want to express yourselves by asking some of the panelists questions, please feel free to raise your hands. We'll hand the mic over.